All right, guys, we're going to talk today about rotations, so make sure that you have all the stuff filled out in your guided notes packet. Same thing that we've been working on in terms of our graphs, just different skill. All right, so a rotation is a turn. Turns are measured in 90 degrees. So that means if I have, let's say, this triangle, and I want to rotate it, it might end up looking something like that based on my degree turns. If a problem is asking you to turn your figure 90 degrees, that just means one turn. 180 degrees is two turns. 270 degrees is three turns. Turns can be clockwise or counterclockwise. And here is where today we really need to understand what origin means, because every problem is going to ask you to rotate around the origin, and the origin is just the point 0, 0 on the graph. It's the middle of the graph. All right, let's move on. All right, guys, so whenever a figure is rotated around the origin, there are some steps that you need to follow. The first one is to write down the original coordinates. The second is to turn your paper based on the number of degrees. The third is to relabel your graph and plot points as though it was normal. And 4, turn paper back to normal and plot actual points. This is going to make much more sense when we start doing examples. Just make sure that these are written down in your notes page.
All right, guys, let's talk really quickly about what clockwise and counterclockwise turns mean. Okay, when I say I want to rotate a figure clockwise, that just means I'm turning my graph like the hands of a clock. Okay, so if I wanted to turn this figure clockwise at all, it would go this way. Okay, so if I wanted to turn, specifically, to relabel my graph, I would turn it to the right. Likewise, counterclockwise means it would move opposite. So again, if this is 12 o'clock and I was moving counterclockwise, my triangle would go this way. So I would turn my paper the opposite way. So every time that we turn our papers, we always want to think, am I moving this triangle the way a clock would move its hands or the opposite? And that'll tell me which way to turn my paper. All right, guys, that's going to be it for me. Let's go ahead and move into some examples. All right, guys, let's look at this example. I have a triangle here, and what I want to do is rotate it 180 degrees around the origin. Remember, the origin is point 0, 0 on my graph. And I'm going to move it clockwise. All right, so immediately 180 degrees tells me I'm going to turn my paper twice. And clockwise means I'm going to turn it 2 times to the right, just like the hands of the clock. But the first thing that I need to do is write down my original coordinates of this triangle. So let's just start with A. A, if I go to my X value, it's at -3. My Y value is at 7. Again, I always have to build the house before I can go to the attic or the basement. Let's do B. B is at -3, 2. All right, and then C is at 1 and 2. Now that I have my original coordinates, my next step is just to rotate my paper or turn it 2 times to the right. So let's do that. 1, 2. Now, my next thing I need to do is I need to relabel my graph, because this is now my y-axis. It's just flipped, and this is my x-axis that's been flipped. And I'm going to even relabel my numbers. And this doesn't have to be perfect, guys. It just has to be so you can see it, so you can easily plot your points. So this becomes -1, -2, -3, 4, -5, -6, -7. All right, now I'm going to remind myself what my original coordinates were. A was at -3 and 7. So I'm going to plot that point here, and that becomes A prime. B, our original B coordinate was at -3, 2. So I'm going to plot that on my new graph, and that's going to become B prime. Now, let's do C. C was at 1 and 2. So I'm going to go to 1 and 2. I'm going to plot that point. That's going to become C prime. Now I'm going to draw my new triangle, which has now been rotated 180 degrees. And my last step is to flip my paper around to normal and write the coordinates of my new triangle from my original graph. So A prime is at 3 and -7. And remember, all I did was I turned my paper around, and now I'm looking at my original graph and plotting points. B prime is at 3, -2. And C prime is at -1 and -2. So there you have it. There's a triangle that's been rotated 180 degrees around the origin with my new coordinates. Let's do another example. Alright guys, let's do a second example. This is our same shape that we just moved, but this time we're going to do 90 degrees counterclockwise. Okay? Now, my 90 degrees tells me that I'm only going to do one turn, and counterclockwise tells me that I'm going to do the opposite of the hands of a clock. So, if I'm looking at my triangle here, if I want to do one turn, my triangle is going to go this way. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my paper. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to relabel my axis. So this now becomes my y-axis, and this becomes my x-axis. This doesn't have to be beautiful. It just has to be so you can easily plot our points. I'm going to relabel it all the way throughout. This becomes -1, -2. Okay, good enough. Alright, our original point A was at -3, 7. So I'm going to plot that point on our graph, and that's going to become A prime. Our original point for B was at -3, 2. I'm going to plot that on my new graph, and that's going to become B prime. And our last point, C, was at 1 and 2. I'm going to plot that on our new graph, and that's going to become C prime. Last step here is to connect all of my points. And now that I've rotated this counterclockwise, I'm going to turn my paper back to the front, and I'm going to plot my new points for A prime, B prime, and C prime. So if I look at my shape, the x value for A prime is at -7, and our y value is at -3. B prime, our y value is at -2, our x value is at -2, our y value is at -3. And lastly, C prime. Our x value is at -2, our y value is at 1. And if I look at my graph, I see that our original triangle is in this quadrant, and then I've rotated it 90 degrees counterclockwise, which is the opposite of our hands of a clock. Alright guys, that's going to be it for me today. Let's go ahead and practice.